that has something to do with my racial legacy, which turned out to be rather complex. But that's also the case if your family was the first German family to arrive in a certain town in the Pacific Northwest. If your family had someone who survived a polio epidemic, if they lived through the Dust Bowl or the Great Depression. Parents pick and choose what they tell their children because they tell them what they think they need them to know. In my case, my parents didn't think I needed to know that because they didn't think I was ready. And when I reached the point where I was ready, it was too late. My father was gone. Luckily, my mother is still here. And when I first started asking her about my grandmother's work, she didn't want to talk about it. She would say to me, tell that story when I'm gone. And then, at first she would talk about this and it would be a little bit of a joke. And then it got a little bit arch. Like, I'm serious. I don't want you to talk about this. And that put me in a dilemma because I had to talk about it. It was sort of a burning itch inside me. I had to know more. And as a journalist, I felt I needed to know more. And because I felt I wanted to give the gift of history to my children eventually, I wanted to know where I came from, I had to figure out how to push and prod and get her to open up about this. And eventually, she started to send little signals that she was ready to maybe talk about this. And then there were further signals that she was ready maybe to let me write about this. And eventually she got in the boat. And she came to see, I think, her mother's work through my eyes. Because what I saw was not just a woman who portrayed a slave. What I saw was a woman who did things that few women did at that time. It was late 1940s to early 1950s. She was traveling throughout the Midwest. How many women traveled back then? How many women worked? She was earning money. She had a paycheck. It was all her own. She could do what she wanted with it. It turned out that, this helped explain those beautiful ensembles and those gloves and those nice purse and shoe combinations that she had. It explained the standard of living that she achieved. It explained how she was able to use some of her own money to found a senior citizen center that still bears her name in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It also explained how she carried herself, the ease that she had in speaking to regular community folk or talking to mayors about how the senior citizen center could use a little bit more money. Thank you very much. She was pretty good at that. She was someone who had won an oratory contest when she was in high school. And when it became time, she was the only black student in her school in that small town in Minnesota. Her father was the town barber. And when it came time for her school to send a representative to the state competition, they decided to forfeit. They didn't send Ione Brown because they didn't want the representative from Alexandria High School to be the lone black student. She showed them. She went on. She got a job working for Quaker Oats selling pancake mix. And when she came back to Alexandria, Minnesota, dressed up as Aunt Jemima, she landed on the front page of the paper. And it was big news. And in that story, I felt my grandmother talking to me because she talked about her work. Now, her daughters at that time felt a little bit ashamed because in 1950, the NAACP and certain civic organizations were mounting a campaign to pressure Quaker Oats to drop the slave item. They were saying enough with the Aunt Jemima. So it wasn't exactly a cool time to be traveling around the country portraying Aunt Jemima, and the daughters didn't like that. But there was no shame in my grandmother's description of her work. She saw herself as an ambassador. She went to small towns where she knew that the children in those small towns perhaps had never seen a person of color. So when she served them pancakes, she told them stories. Sometimes she sang gospel songs. She said in that newspaper clipping that she wanted them to know she was a Christian, a church-going woman. She, looking at the picture, tied her headscarf, yes, in the front of her head, but it had a little bit of brio. I mean, she rocked it a little bit. She had her own style even then. She used that opportunity to show people what she could be. And in some way, in reaching back, I learned painful things, but I learned amazing things about these so-called ordinary people. They saw themselves as individuals who were always on display, who were always trying to show people what they could be. Sorry, the spirits are speaking to us. They wanted to show the world what they could be. My father, who left Birmingham, went north, bought a house on the south side of Minneapolis, first black family to buy a house in that neighborhood, kept that house as if it were a model home. The garden was beautiful. The sidewalk was always shoveled before anybody else even woke up. So when the neighborhood woke up, they saw that Belvin and Betty Norris took care of their home. When Belvin and Betty Norris sent their children out, our tennis shoes were cleaned. It looked like we cleaned them with toothbrushes. We always looked like we were, as I said, on display. My grandmother obviously did that with her own life. What they were trying to do is send a message. They wanted to show America what they could be, but they also wanted to show America what it could be. I learned profound lessons in looking back at my family history. I learned lessons about my own family and about how we are shaped not just by those things that are said in our homes, but also shaped by the weight of silence, shaped by those things that are unsaid, yet still serve as almost like a force field inside a home. And as the stories came spilling out over time, my mother, who was initially so reluctant to tell these stories, suddenly got comfortable. And I'll tell you a secret, I use my children in this, because when I have 2 young children, and when I would talk to her, I felt that she thought maybe I would judge her, or maybe I still wasn't ready. Maybe she still saw me as that daughter she tried to protect. But she was much more open in talking to the kids. She would sort of talk to me through them and telling stories. And I learned how naive I was, I guess, in some ways, because there are things that they didn't tell me, but there are also things that I didn't see. And I wonder in some ways how complicit I was in that silence. Did I not give my grandmother an opportunity to tell me that story? Did I fail to give my father an opportunity to tell me about his shooting? I'll take that worry with me to my grave. But now that they're telling stories, I can fill in the blanks. And I want to share with you a little bit of what I learned about my childhood and my parents' experiences. When they finally, we're talking about being on display, when they finally moved to the south side of Minneapolis, my father, who stood up to a policeman, learned how to stand up to the system in other ways. And one of the ways he did that was by using his GI Bill to buy a house on the south side of Minneapolis. As I said, he and my mother were the first black family to move into this neighborhood. They were so-called blockbusters. How many of you have heard that term before? Now, in some cases, these were families that were carefully chosen to integrate a neighborhood because they knew they would be under scrutiny. They knew that they had to withstand the scrutiny in the loan process, and they knew that if there was newspaper coverage when the black family moved in, that they had to be a family that had a totally upstanding record. In this case, the NAACP didn't push my parents to buy this house. They were not encouraged by the Urban League. They just up and decided that they wanted a house on the south side of Minneapolis, and they saw a house they liked on Oakland Avenue, and they finally, after trying several times, found a family that would sell their home to them. When I grew up in Minneapolis, I grew up in a very integrated neighborhood, and I just thought that that's the way things were. Even though my father was from Birmingham, and I spent summers in Birmingham, and my life in Birmingham was very different than my life in Minnesota, I took that integration for granted. I thought it was just something that happened. My parents didn't talk much about their initial reception. And now that the spigot is open, now that I understand, I realize what it took for them to move into this neighborhood. And I realize when we talk about integration, and we talk about civil rights, and we talk about the fall of segregation in this country, we often think of it in historic terms, what we read about in history books, what we see in a PBS documentary. But it's something that happens little bit by little bit. It happens office by office, desk by desk, school bus ride by school bus ride, mortgage transaction by mortgage transaction. And in my parents' case, it was a difficult history. When they purchased their house, every other neighbor whose property line touched theirs moved out almost overnight, or at least attempted to move out overnight. They sold as quickly as they could. And once people realized that a black family was in the neighborhood, it was a little bit tougher to sell. Now, Mom, who initially had a hard time talking about these stories, now takes a little bit of relish in telling these tales. She's gotten comfortable. She's willing to look back over her shoulder with clear eyes. And there's one story I want to share with you because it tickles me every time I think about it, and it represents the moment when I realized that I could actually talk, that my parents were willing, my surviving parent, my mother was willing to talk to me about this. My parents found a 3-bedroom, 2-story Tudor revival. It's a style of home that may be familiar to many of you. Stucco home with dark trim. And my parents moved in within a week. And the White families whose property line touched ours soon put their homes up for sale. 3 who owned houses across from my parents also decided to decamp. As my parents celebrated their new home with a picnic supper amid boxes in the living room, their neighbors furiously burned the dial, calling each other, calling my folks' mortgage lender to complain, and eventually calling real estate agents to put their own homes up for sale, pronto. Mom says she watched the white flight with a mixture of anger and amusement. The desperation of her new neighbors to sell gave her an opportunity for a little mischief. Every time a real estate agent pulled up with a prospective buyer, she would send my older sisters, Marguerite and Cindy, out to play in the yard. Or she would saunter out herself, holding her back or stretching her arms, so anyone could plainly see that another child was on the way. That child was me. My sisters and I never knew of any of this until recently, but now Mom loves telling the story. I'd wait until they got inside the house, had time to check out the bedrooms and look inside the closets, and right about the moment I thought they were in the kitchen, giving it a real good look-see, I'd say to myself, "Showtime." She'd send her kids outside. Now that's an example of one of the stories that I heard that made me laugh. But if you want to have an honest conversation about race, there might be laughter. Sometimes the laughter can mask something else. But if you really want to have an honest conversation, you're going to hear something that rubs you the wrong way. You might wind up with a little bit of indigestion. And in the course of trying to understand the path my family traveled, I had my share of those experiences as well. I tried to learn as much as I could about my father's shooting, and one of the people that helped me understand what happened is the sister of one of the neighbors that was with my father that night. The night my father was shot, he was out on the town. He had just returned from war, and he was with his brother Woodrow and a family friend, John Beaton. John Beaton's sister is one of the women who helped me fill in the blanks. She helped me unlock the mysteries of this story. She also unburdened herself in the course of helping me understand what happened. She was but a child at the time, very young. She was about 5 or 6 years old. And she remembers them coming home. But what she also remembers is growing up in a city that had a strict racial code that told her where she could sit, where she could eat. When she went to the movies, she paid for the movie up front, then she went out the door, then she went around the side, then she went around the back of the building, and then she walked up a fire escape to go watch the movie from the balcony. She remembers getting on a bus in Birmingham and having to stand behind the placard. They used to have wooden placards that were attached to the seats by a chain. Having to stand behind that even though there were many seats up front. Now, some people experience this and manage to move on. My father was an example of that. He managed to process this and somehow move forward with optimism. Julia Beaton was not one of those people. She's deeply scarred by this, and it became clear when she told me her story. Julia Beaton told me that I have no white American friends. I just don't care for them, she said. I just don't trust them. I've always told my sons and my grandsons not to bring a woman in this house who does not look like me. That is a point of respect. I have a problem with entertainers and the athletes, Sidney Poitier and